Hi, I'm Fabrice Harari. Welcome to WinDevCon 2007 Requirement List Development course. We're going to see how to build a requirement list step by step, how, with whom, when, and all this sort of thing. The first thing, of course, is to define exactly what is a requirement list. It's a detailed description of a program or website. It covers all aspects of the development, graphical aspect, graphical charter, color to use, not to use, size of screen, all these kind of details that you have to define if you want something to be good for the customer and easy to work on for you. The organization of the program, what kind of menu are you going to have, what are the items that will be in each menu, all this kind of thing. It's really the functional organization. And of course the content of the whole thing. On a website, by example, you can either have a static website where the user has to give you the content beforehand, or a website that is fully dynamic where the content is going to be entered by the customer afterwards. In all cases you need to define what the content will be and who is going to create it and put it in place. Same thing in a program where the content is going to be really all the functions, all the things that will be in the program. Should you also have a database of all the cities of the United States, by example, included in already in the program at the beginning or not? Or will they enter their own city each time they create a new address? All these kind of details has to be in the requirement list. Also the time constraints. When you define a requirement list, you're going also to define the time necessary to do this or that, and when everything will be available. This of course can be relative to beginning time. That can be any time that you choose, and also conditional to the fact that this is accepted in the next 3 weeks or 2 months or whatever. All that is of course fluent, but you need to define all these points. Basically it's the list of all the things the program or website has to do and how. It really is the story of the product. So creating a requirement list is really the first step for any software or website development. If it is incorrect or incomplete, you're going to have lots of difficulties. The development will be difficult because, of course, if you don't have a full list of all the things that the software has to do, well, you won't know what it has to do, and you will have to go back and forth with the customer and have changes and all this kind of thing. I'm sure you all already had this kind of problem. The relationship between the developers and the customer will be bad. Clearly, if everything is not defined, you're going to do something and it's not what the customer needs, so he will going to tell you, it's not what I wanted, that's not what I told you, and you're going to say, well, that's what I understood, and so on and so forth. If it's not defined precisely, you're going to get in trouble. It can lead to a broken relationship between you and the customer, and bad reputation for your company, and also lawsuits. And in most civilized country, the law is in favor of the customer, which means that if you do not define precisely what the program is supposed to do in the first place, well, generally it's the customer interpretation that is good. Now, if you define something that is extremely precise, and you have a bad faith customer and it goes to a lawsuit, you are going to win. And well, generally it won't go to a lawsuit because well, they know they're going to lose. That's for sure. That's really up to you. It's a really huge protection to have a really good requirement list in the first step. Even with all these important consequences, if you do not do a good requirement list, in the last 20 years, more often than not, I've seen a requirement list that were very quickly done, incomplete, incorrect, quasi-empty. Why? Well, often when the project is not very big, administration big or things like that, government project big, the customer doesn't think about a requirement list. In fact, the customer doesn't know what a requirement list is. So it's up to you to bring the subject, to create a requirement list, to extract information from the customer to know exactly what he needs. And it's basically impossible to make the customer pay for it. It's a huge work. Don't kid yourself. It's a really big work to create a requirement list that is valid. But the customer will not pay for it because, well, it doesn't know what it is. Even if it's really the skeleton of what he's going to get afterwards. So basically, you have to consider that the requirement list is part of the sales process. It's what you have to invest in order to get the job. And really, it's mandatory if you don't want to run in trouble afterwards. In some cases, if you don't create a good requirement list, you're just going to lose the customer and the project. An example I have about that is something that happened to me 15 years ago, something like that. I had a potential customer, contact me because he wanted to have a specific software developed just for him. It was a statistical calculation on horse races. PMU is the name of the organization managing the horse races in France. And he wanted to be able to enter all the races results for the last 5-10 years or so on. Make statistical calculation with it. And of course predict who the winner will be for the next courses. So the first thing I told him is that according to my knowledge of statistics, he wouldn't be able to find who the winner will be. But even like that, he said, no, I have a method. I know that I can find who the next winner will be, and this is how I want it to work. And he started to describe the whole thing with the calculation he wanted and all that. So I came back to my office and started to write the requirement list, and came back to him with a 26-page requirement list with all the calculation detailed, what would be in the database, how it would work, and so on and so forth. And well, I got the job. And when the customer told me that, he said, well, you're not the only one I consulted. I had 4 other proposals from other companies. So I asked him, why did you choose me? He told me, well, it's because I think you're the only one who understood what I wanted. And I wanted more explanation. I wanted to understand what he was saying. And he showed me the proposal from the other company, where I had 26 pages. They had 1 or 2 pages. One of the proposal was creating a software for statistical calculation on horse races and the amount. So clearly, I was not the cheapest of the 4. I was not the most expensive either, but that's another problem. I was the only one who described all the processes, all the way it was going to work, everything in detail. And when the guy looked at that, he said, okay, that's what I want. And the other one, what he saw is, let's hope. And I just got the job because of the requirement list. On the other hand, the other didn't get the job because of their absence of requirement list. Now, it's also generally ignored when doing in-house development. Most of the time, when you are working in your own company and designing software for your own company, you are not writing requirement list for your project. Well, there's no need. You are the customer. You know what you want. Well, yes, of course, you know what you want, but it leads to more work not to do a requirement list, because problems haven't been considered beforehand. You start to work on one little piece of your software, and then you add another one, and then another one, and then another one, and so on. And well, when you arrive at the 15th other one, you realize that something is missing in the first one to make this one work. And that is something that you would probably have realized if you had written a requirement list. Because at the moment where you would start to describe the 15th point, you would say, oh, I need this. I don't have it. Oh, so I have to change that. And oh, therefore there is a relationship with that one, so it's going to change that also. Of course, if it's just a field missing in a file, it's very easy with WinDev to add it, and it modifies automatically your database if you are using, of course, a hyperfile database or something like that. But still, there can be many different things. It can be just that, okay, it's a few fields that are missing, and also the whole functionality to manage it. And now your UI to manage the first part is not made to accommodate that, and you have to redo the work. Things are going to be not compatible if you do them step by step instead of preparing for it beforehand. Some cases are not included, some work needs to be redone, and you are in the end losing time. It's once again one of those things where you have the feeling of losing time when you're doing it, and you realize, or not, when you are using that requirement list afterward, that you are in fact gaining a lot of time for each development, because now you just have to read your paper and follow the lead. Why is it so difficult to establish a correct requirement list? Well, basically you have two problems. The customer doesn't understand anything about software development, and that's 99% of the time. And then the developer doesn't know anything about the customer job or activity. Of course, if you already know the customer job, there's a good chance that you already have ready to run software for that activity. So it means that most of the time you don't know what you are talking about, and the customer doesn't either. So clearly none of the two can establish the requirement list alone. You have to collaborate to be able to produce a correct requirement list. You are not going to be able to invent what the software needs to do, and the customer is not going to be able to invent how the software is going to do that. So writing a requirement list is really a phase of exploration and explication. You have to ask questions, lots of them. The customer has to answer them. You have to tell things to the customer who should ask you questions, and that part is probably not going to work very well because they don't know what questions to ask. So you really have to explain a lot how things are going to work and this and that, and ask many questions to be sure that you are covering all the aspects of the problem. And the first thing to do that is to make the customer understand what a requirement list is, how you're going to establish that with him, and what is the use of a requirement list, why you need to make one, and why it's going to be the first step in building the software needs. So really that's the first thing to do. Then you have to make him agree to invest in that phase, and by invest I mean invest time, because it takes time to create a requirement list, and if the user tells you, oh, I don't have the time to do that, well, tell him, well, in that case I don't have the time to create a software for you because I don't know what to create. And when a customer tells you, well, we'll do that each step by step, then you said, okay, in that case you'll pay me step by step based on the number of hours I'm going to spend. I cannot give you any price beforehand. That generally is something that makes them think. If you are able to, you have to make him agree to pay for it at least as soon as the project is a little complex. Writing a requirement list is something that can take weeks, months literally, depending on the complexity of the project. And clearly you are not here to work for free for weeks or months. So you have to make him understand and make him pay for it. After all, once the customer has got the requirement list, nothing prevents him from using that requirement list to have the development done by another company. So a thing that you can do is to have a contract with the customer for the requirement list that says, okay, if the price that is in the requirement list is accepted by the customer and the development is done by our company, then the requirement list by itself is free. But if you are not accepting the proposal or deciding that you want the development done by another company, which is absolutely your right, we have no problem with that, then the establishment of the requirement list will cost this amount. That's a possibility. I personally don't like it because at that point the customer doesn't need you anymore, and very often you're in trouble to get paid. But it's one way of doing things. Another is to be clear enough at the beginning and say, well, if you don't want me to establish the requirement list and if you're not ready to pay for it, then you need to find another company. We have other customers who know how to work and we don't need you. Of course, you have to say that in a more diplomatic fashion, but basically that's the message. There are really projects that you shouldn't do. If you don't know that already, believe me on that one, there are many projects out there that you shouldn't do at all, because, well, you're going to be in trouble. And the fact that the customer doesn't understand the requirement list, doesn't understand the need for it, the time that it takes and the price that it costs, is a very good sign that you're probably going to end up in trouble with that customer. I'm going to give you a method to manage a requirement list development. It's the method I'm using. It's a method that I have refined in more than 20 years of development. It's not specifically any method that is out there under any fancy name, any fancy theory of anything like that. It's just the method I'm using. It's a method that it's working. It's working in the real life. It's not any design made by a guy in a university who never saw a customer in the first place. So it's really something that you can rely on. Of course, you can use it in a simpler or more complex way, depending if you have one person to talk to as a customer, or 300 people who are involved in the project and need to tell you this and that about this or that point on that specific project. Basically, there are four phases in your requirement list development. The first is the initial description. The initial description is something that you do very broadly. In a software, typically it's going to be the list of the main functions. You're not going to enter in all the sub-functions or anything like that. You're just going to list all the functions that need to be done. Then you're going to go into the details by doing the question and answer phase. Don't be afraid, we're going to go in much more detail with each of those steps later. But basically it's that. You first do an initial description of the thing, and then for each of them you're going to ask questions. How do you want to do this? How do you want to do that? You're going to propose things. Do you like this? Do you like that? Do you need this or that? Where do you put this? How is this problem solved? And so on. And at the same time, the customer are going to ask you questions too. So that's the question and answer phase. Then you have the comments phase. Once you have what you think is a working requirement list, you need to get comments from the people who are going to use the product. And for that you're going to send the corresponding part of your requirement list to the appropriate person. And then you have the estimate. The estimate is not always necessary in a requirement list. You can be paid just to do the requirement list and don't care about how long it's going to take for each phase, but most of the time it's going to be part of your job to also give an estimate for each phase. So these are the four phases of the requirement list development. Clearly, you're going to have a communication problem to deal with. There are information that you're going to need to send, information that you're going to need to receive from the customer, and there's going to be lots of it, lots and lots and lots of information. So you have to devise a way to do that as practically as possible. Of course, there's the face-to-face communication. Generally, it's needed at least for an initial session. In some cases, with some customer, it's the only way, because some customers just don't work well from a distance, and in some cases you have to initiate nearly a torture session to extract information. I have in mind a session that I had with a customer that lasted perhaps 3 hours, and during which I had to extract from the guy how he was calculating the sell price on second-hand electronic components. Well, it just didn't know. It didn't have any mathematical formula. He was doing that because he had been doing that for 20 years, and he knew the price that he was probably going to be able to find it at his different sources, and because of that he knew, okay, this one is not really reliable, will I get the and or not. So he would make the price based on all these parameters without really knowing how he was doing it. And we needed 3 hours together with me asking questions and pushing him and pushing him and pushing him to devise a mathematical way to do what he was doing nearly by instinct. So in this kind of situation, of course, you're going to need face-to-face time. Try to avoid that as much as you can, because you are losing time each and every day. With this kind of thing, you have to go to the place, go back, and during this time things are not going further. So face-to-face time for me is something that I do only when I cannot do anything else. In fact, I have some customer that I have never seen. In fact, I have some customer that I've met for the first time during this WinDevCon session, and I've been working with them for a month and doing things and without ever seeing each other. So it's perfectly possible. It's sometimes more difficult, but try to avoid the face-to-face time as much as you can. Of course, you have the wonderful snail mail. Well, clearly you don't want to rely on that. It's slow, and when you know that there's already a slow reaction time from the customer side, each time you're asking a question, they're going to look at the question, think about it, really work on it perhaps a few days later if you're lucky, or not, and then you have to ask again and push them, and all that. Clearly, if you do that by a snail mail, you don't need the added transport time. And of course, there's the huge disadvantage with that method of snail mail, that if the customer answers the same way, then you have to retype everything it is saying in your internal documentation. So it's really a full loss of time. Forget about that one. Then you have the phone. Phone is a great thing, but for a requirement list it's not really the best one. The first thing is that generally people are not available when you are calling them, so you need to make appointments, lose time, wait for them, and so on. Then there is no trace of what you said during that thing, so you can of course record the phone conversation. Then you have legal issue with the recording a phone conversation in some cases, and well, it's not practical. And again, you have to retype information in your internal documentation. If you don't, this information is going to get lost forever. So the really practical way to do that is via email. It's faster. You have a trace. You have a trace that is on the technical side. Well, when you work on something on a document, you can go in the email, original email, and see exactly what was the answer. Was that really that, or was there something I didn't understand at the time? So you have a technical trace. And then of course you have a legal trace. If the customer at some point tells you, I never told you that, and well, I don't know for you, but I heard that a few times. Well, in that case, you just go back to your file, look in your email, print it, give it to the customer, and tell him, okay, here is your answer to the question at the time. You did tell me that. Of course, there's the practical side, or you just copy and paste the customer answer in your main requirement list, and you have already what you need. But in an email you often have a formatting problem. Things can get ugly on a formatting standpoint in an email very fast. So one solution to that is to use attached documents. You have your main email that is basically just a header, and then you have the real question and information going back and forth in an attached document where all formatting are possible. A good thing to do also is to use a PDF file as an attached document, because it's not modifiable. You are sending a question, you don't want the question to be modified, you want an answer to that question. So depending on the case, sending question by attached PDF is sometimes really the best way to do it. Let's talk about the initial description. Often it can be done, or at least started, by the customer or in an initial discussion with the customer. It can be done entirely inside a customer organization. but generally in that case you will see that many information that you would like to have in this initial description is missing, or not formatted the right way, or not organized in a very usable way. So you will have to be the guide really about what you need in order to start the process. The first part of the initial description is to create a very general description of the needed functions. By example, a customer management function including a customer form, billing, payment management, mailing and sales process management. That's all. That's what the customer wants. After that you'll go into detail, but that's what he wants. Another one, prospect, contact, appointment management. Okay, the customer wants to be able to contact prospects and make appointment with them. So you're going to need to manage that. Then he wants a module to manage all the mail received, not only the emails, but all the mails, scan them, store them, and record the corresponding action that has been taken by whom, and so on. So that's just a few examples of general description of needed function. You can of course have many things in there, but it just doesn't need to be very detailed. You just need to have an idea of what the customer wants. When the customer is already doing this kind of thing, either by hand or using another software that is out of date or not complete or whatever, always include examples of the work that is currently done. By example, if the customer is asking for you for a module to create invoices, there's a very good chance that it's already doing invoices one way or another. So ask for practical example. Ask for a minimum example. By example, an invoice with just one item on it. An average example, ask them, okay, generally your invoice are what, 5, 10 items? Okay, give me one of those. And then the maximum example. Okay, what is your biggest, one of your biggest invoices? Why do you need that? Well, because in some cases customer do things that are very simple. I had customer where invoices were never more than 5 items. So I didn't need to create anything that would manage more than 10 lines. So in that case you can do things sometimes in a more simple way and don't deal with, okay, next page, previous page, scroll bar and all that, and have just a fixed input. Now, does that mean that in the future they are not going to need that? That's one of the questions that you're going to have to ask, of course. But if you have at the beginning an idea of what is the biggest thing that they are doing and the minimum thing they are doing, then you know what you're dealing with. If the maximum bill is something that span on 13 pages, well, you know that you're going to need something that is really practical, where they can enter a lot of information, not lose the information if they lose power, and there are lots of aspects that you're going to consider differently. In some case, customer will not want to give you information because there are names on it or information that they found is confidential. Well, in that case, tell them to blacken the name if needed, to blacken the address. You don't care about name, address, who is buying what. That's not the problem. The problem is the volume. The problem is the structure. The problem is how they work. So make them understand that confidential information is not needed. How this information is handled is needed. Always transmit this kind of document as scan, image or PDF in order for you to be able to include them in your main document, in your main requirement list. If the user send that to you as a paper, then do the scan yourself and include that in your main document. You will want to always have everything available in this requirement list and not as something that is in a file somewhere, not viewable immediately for discussion or work on. Then the second thing to do in the initial description is to create a general description of hardware architecture, either in place or needed. And I'm not talking here about, okay, we need 11 PCs with 2 GB of memory and a hard drive that size. That's not a general description. Here's what I'm talking about. By example, each group of users works independently. There's no information sharing between these groups. Or each group average n users, it's between 3 and 15 typically. They're all in the same physical location. Or another case, some of them are using laptop and working at the main location or remotely. Another case is some need to be able to work independently and synchronize their information for the following reason. So that is the general description of the hardware. It's really about who is doing what where. So what does that give you? Well, obviously you see in the 1 and 2 that this gives you clue about the logical architecture that you're going to need to build. Either work in a network, work with replication, work with remote access. All this is going to be given to you by the really hardware architecture. How are they physically working? And it's not only computer wire. It's really people. Where are there, what kind of tools are they using, and how. If the hardware structure is already in place, your customer already has a computer, networks, and so on and so forth. Describe it. You don't need to be extremely precise on the type of computer and all that, but you need to say, okay, the customer is using a network, 100 megabit network with 15 computers in it. Why are you going to describe it? Because, well, in some case this hardware already in place is not adapted to what the user now wants to do, and you need to know what they have and how they're dealing with it in order to say, okay, when you're asking me to do that, but you can't do that with that hardware already in place or the way you are using it. Eventually add the enhancement that is needed or desired. Okay, perhaps the user wants some hardware, perhaps he's going to need some hardware added to his existing infrastructure and he doesn't know about it, and you will have to deal with that in order for your software solution to work. An example is you're writing a software that is all about allowing the customer salespeople to take orders at a customer site and transmit them easily to the main site. Well, perhaps you will need to change some hardware at the same time, add laptop for the salespeople who are currently working with a paper and a pen, add some transmission means, either a big T1 at the customer side for everybody to be able to connect from the outside, or modems, or whatever mean you're going to need to do that, and so on. So obviously if you're adding a function as a software, there can be repercussion on the hardware side, and you're going to need to deal with that one way or another. Even if you are not selling the hardware, you need to have that listed in your requirement list, because, well, obviously, even if you don't sell hardware at all, you don't do that ever. I don't. I don't sell hardware. If the customer wants some hardware, I will describe to him exactly what he needs. Eventually we'll tell him go on that website and order this and that precisely, but I'm not selling the hardware because I'm not dealing with the maintenance afterwards. I'm not dealing with all this kind of problem. It doesn't mean that I don't have an need to help the customer with that. And of course, if the customer doesn't have the hardware needed for my software to work, I'm in trouble. So if there is no hardware in place, it's even more important to advise the customer. Even if you are not selling the hardware, or I would say even more if you are not selling the hardware. Because clearly if you are telling the customer, okay, I'm going to create your software for network use, and the customer just buy 10 beautiful iMac, okay, my software is working under Windows, so now we need to add Windows on the iMacs, and it's not in the initial budget, and so on. So you really, as the software guy, have an extremely important role as the hardware advisor. Of course, you can also sell the hardware if you want to do that. That's really a question of organization. Clearly, if the hardware doesn't match the software need, your application won't work. The customer will not understand why your application won't work. They are not in computers, and you will get in trouble. You're the one who has the absolute necessity to advise your customer. So the questions to ask to find out what hardware is needed are really about people. Who is doing what, where, and how. That's how you're going to find out if you need laptop, desktop, mobile device, capability to read barcode, capability to print barcodes, and so on. There's no limit to what you're going to need to define on the hardware side based on the functionality of your software. The next step is to create a list of main correspondents. That list have to have the name, the mail, email address, and the phone number for each of them. You need one correspondent for each module described in the first part of your description, the general function description. Who is in charge of billing? Who is in charge of sales people? Who is in charge of prospection? Who is in charge of stock? And so on and so forth. It's really rare that one person knows everything in an organization. If somebody tells you, I'm your only correspondent for that project, I know everything about this organization, then the information that you are receiving is suspect. Each time I have seen that, I was in trouble afterwards because, well, nobody knows everything about how things are done in a company, except if it's a very small company. As soon as you have 20, 30, 50, 200 people in the company, there's no way. So if somebody tells you that, it's a really bad sign for the project. You will have to work very hard to have access to more people. Of course, it's possible to have several correspondents for each function, and to have the same person responsible for several functions. Not all of them, but several. Clearly it's possible. The people in this list will be responsible for answering your questions. So it's extremely important to have that list and to have people in that list who are not only able to answer your question, but willing to answer your question. Your contact with these people is going to condition the quality of information you're going to receive. So this is something where you have to work in a very smart way with each people in order to really get information, don't stamp on their feet, and really be diplomatic and make them feel important at the same time. It's the social part of the requirement list creation, and it's as important as the contact that you have with the main customer correspondent, with the boss, the one who's paying. Because if you have bad contact with all these people, this is going to go up to the boss, and the boss is going to say, okay, this guy, it's not working out. So this is a very important phase, to have this list of correspondents and to really reach out to them in a way that makes them comfortable. The general and specific condition is not part of the requirement list initial description per se. It can be done in a separate document, but it's extremely important to formalize all these problems very early in your relationship with the customer. Any type of things in that aspect can break the relationship with the customer, and there's absolutely no point to work for weeks on a requirement list if the customer doesn't agree with your way of working. So general and specific condition can be your general way of working and your specific condition for that specific project. So it can really be part of the requirement list or outside document, specific to each project, but it needs to be formalized with the customer in a contract. And I personally prefer to include them in the first document going to the customer, the requirement list initial description. It will be part of the main document the whole way. I will never remove them from the requirement list, and this way there is no possibility for the customer to say, I didn't know, I didn't agree to that, I didn't want to. From the start you are protected. From the first document you are sending to the customer, you have your general and specific condition in place, and if something doesn't work for the customer, you can discuss it, find a solution, find a deal, and change them for the next version, but at least you are good to go. Examples of call general or specific condition. The customer wants a license for his 40 offices to be included in the development price. It doesn't want to have to pay afterwards for each office that is going to use the software you are developing. So this has to be included. The customer wants the source full property. It happens. Generally the answer is yes, no problem, it's just going to be more expensive. The customer wants the project source to be stored at a lawyer's office in case of developer default. Well, okay, if your company crash, or if you are not providing what you are supposed to provide in a timely fashion, or you will have to define what is, of course, the developer default. You will have to define who is paying for the lawyer's work, because this guy don't work for free, believe me. And of course that's the second best thing, when the customers say, okay, I don't want the source full property anymore because it's too expensive, but I want a security that if you die, something will be possible for me to go forward. The customer wants a software debug and support for a year included in the development price. He knows that afterwards he will have to pay for that, but he wants that to be included. Or, well, you just want to say that the support is included for 3 months, and afterwards it will cost the customer that much each month or a year to have the service.
The customer wants the software company to provide a 24/7 support by phone. Okay, so that means that you need to have guys available at a support center around the clock. This has a cost. If you don't have that already, you're going to need to hire people. So all that is going to have a cost that you're going to make the customer pay, and all that needs to be formalized very early. Of course, you have the development has to be finished prior to a specific date, or in less than 6 months after the initial date, and so on and so forth. Installation, how you're going to install the software, training, updates can and should be described here as much as possible. By example, if you never included training in your software development, and the customer is thinking that the training is included, if you don't talk about it, you're going to be in trouble as soon as the development is finished. So you don't want to have any surprise, and the customer doesn't want to have any surprise. It's a good idea to tell the customer, okay, installation is going to be done by the customer by just downloading the software and clicking on the executable, on the installer from our website. Or installation is going to be done by us remotely using VNC, which means that the customer needs to have VNC server installed and ports open for you to be able to do the job. Updates will be done automatically. The software will connect to see if there's a new version and will automatically be downloaded. That means that in some case the security on the customer side has to be modified to allow that. So all this kind of thing is really part of the project. If you are not describing them very early, then you are open to any kind of idea from the customer. Another one that you need to talk about at some point is if you have an initial data transfer from a previous software or database. If the customer needs transfer all the time, then it's clearly a function, a general function of the software. Now, if the only thing he needs is an initial data transfer, it's often something that you are going to do with your internal tools, the tools coming with WinDev, by example, and you're just going to give the customer his initial database with the data transferred. In that case, it's not part of the general development. It's a service that you are selling to the customer. You must describe it precisely, tell them in which shape the data is going to arrive, what data, what is not transferable, how much is going to cost, when they are going to have that, how long they are going to have to stop using their software for you to be able to do the transfer and give them the new database. All these kind of things are questions that are really need to be solved, and that's the place and the time to do it. And often the customer believes that giving you information about his job activity gives him automatic intellectual property rights on the software you are writing. And then if you are reselling that software as a generic vertical software, he thinks he is allowed a cut on the sales. Well, if you think of doing just that, you need to have that problem resolved beforehand with him one way or another. It can be that it's a very good idea to give the guy a cut on the sales, but only if he's giving you the leads, or if he's coming with the sale already done and at a different rate. It can be that it's a good idea to give him a cut on the sale just to be a referral for the other one and to agree to answer questions from the potential customer and give them information about how well the software is working and so on. So it's not always a clear-cut case saying no, you have absolutely no right and you will get no money if I resell the software. it can be a very good idea to partner, in fact, with your initial customer who wants a specific software to make something bigger out of it.
So let's now have a look at the second phase, question and answer. At this point, your phase 1 is done. You have sent the general description that you made based on everything that was given to you to the customer, and the customer agrees with the general description. So that's the first phase. We are starting the question and answer. So your first thing to do is to create a list of questions on the function that are described in the phase 1 part A general description of function. So for each of those you're going to either write a detailed description or ask for one. If you already have enough information, you can write it yourself and ask for detail, more information, confirmation and so on in the questions. If you don't have enough, then you're going to ask a question: how do you want to do this, how do you want to do that, for each function. You also need to create a detailed technical description based on 1B. 1B was the general description talking about what was done by whom, where. Now you're going to say, okay, we're going to need this kind of hardware, we're going to need this, we're going to need that, and you're going to describe all that and ask questions based on that. And of course, if you followed my advice and joined to the general description the general and specific condition, you're going to deal with all the details and modification on this part 1D with alternative proposal, problem description and so on. You're going to send the questions and proposals to each correspondent listed in the list of correspondent 1C with a copy to the main correspondent. You don't need to wait till you've done all the 3 previous list of questions to send everything. You can start sending questions as soon as they are ready. But each time, remember to send a copy, visible copy, to the main correspondent. It's very important that the main correspondent, if he's not involved at all in that process, because, well, he's not supposed to answer any specific question about any function, that's not his job. Well, it's very important that he still be involved in the process and that he still get a copy of everything. And it's also extremely important that each correspondent knows that, and knows that the question has been sent also to possibly the boss. That will probably increase your answer rate quite some. Do also a constant follow-up of the answer status. If you're waiting for an answer and it's not coming in, don't wait, just act. Send a second email, send a phone call, do things and keep a trace of everything you're doing. If at some point the main correspondent is going to ask why are we not further ahead, you will be able to say because your correspondent are not answering me, and you will be able to document that. And before you arrive to that point, you should contact the main correspondent and say, okay, hey, I have a problem, I can't get my answers. So to do this follow-up of the answer status and follow-up of the whole process, a very good way to work is to create a tree view of all questions and answers. The main correspondent at least will have access to it, you too of course, and possibly the other correspondent too, to see what's going on in the other part of the company. It creates a dynamic. They see that other people are answering, so things are going further along. That's something that you have to discuss with your main correspondent, who is allowed to have access to the whole thing. There are 2 different ways of doing that. One is simply to use a Word document in which you add all the question answers and send it back to the main correspondent and the other one each time new information is available. That works well when there is a small number of correspondents or it's a small project. If you have a bigger number of users and a big project, it's better to use a page. You do not link it to anything or anybody. You just give a direct access to a web page and you protect it by a password. This way there's no confidentiality problem. Only the people who are allowed to see it can see it, and they can in real time see what's going on. The page is going to look something like this. This is just an example. It is formatted more like a Word, the Word option would be. On a web page you can of course do exactly that, or do something prettier with icons, use a real tree view field and so on. It's all up to you. So this is how it would look in Word by example. As you can see, I took the same function description that we had in the example in 1A, customer management, including customer form, billing, payment management, mailing, sale process management, except that now it's separated in several sub-parts, each corresponding to one specific function. What is remarkable on that list is that each underscore text, by example, customer form here, billing, is a link to the corresponding document. You're not going to put the whole question and answer thing in one document like that, not for managing the question and answer process. You will have a main document with all information in a synthetic form, of course, based on what the question and answer will be. But that is the management of the question answer only. So you want to have a list of questions, access to the corresponding question text, but not cluttering your list with that, and answer to access also to the answers. So as you can see here, there is an answer received on May 18, and it's an underscore because it's a link to the answer. You can see that at some point it's the subpart with a link, or the main one when there is no subpart. This one is 4 different modules, in fact, regrouped under customer management. This one is the single module, there's nothing below it, so it's very easy. Also, you can see that some dates are in red. The red dates are for expected answer. You sent a question to Mr. X here on May 13 and you are expecting the answer before May 20. So this date here is your breaking point. At that point you're going to do something to get your answer if you haven't received it yet. You can see that here this one was sent to Mr. Z on May 13 and received on May 18, so there's no more expected answer. In that case you have an answer received on May 20, and then this answer made you ask secondary questions about delay and letters text, by example, and you send it to Mr. A again, the same guy, on May 22, once you had the time to study the answer. So the answer is now expected on May 29, and you can have as many levels as you need in order to really clarify something, or if something now because of that makes you think of another question based on that, you're going to add a new one that you send to somebody else about something else. So the dates in red are for expected answer. The fact that they're in red allows you to visually control what remains to be done. You know that everything is red is something that was not received, not done, so you have to manage that. So every day you can come there, see if you reach any date, and eventually contact, pressure, call, however you want to manage that, but do something about it. Eventually it was going to be here. When May 20 arrive, you're going to add there, send a second mail to Mr. X, same mail, to ask why no answer on first one. And of course, each time there is a copy to the main correspondent at the same time. The usual delay between sending and receiving is 1 week. That's what I practice. I found out that if you expect people to answer you in 24 hours, 48 hours, 3 days, well, most of the time it's not going to happen, and you're going to have to call them back and bother them and so on. It's important to let the people have some wiggle room around your questions, because, well, they have to think about it. They are still working their regular jobs, so they don't have all the time in the world to answer you, and you don't want also at the same time to anger them and have less cooperation because of that. So it's kind of a thing that you have to deal with. How long do you accept for an answer? And that's something that you need to agree upon with the main correspondent beforehand. You're going to tell him, here is how it's going to work. I generally use a 1 week delay. Is that acceptable for you? And depending on his organization, he can tell you, well, in that period of the year we are extremely busy, so it would be better if we did that for 10 days instead of 1 week. And you just manage that in 10 days increment. It can be also that he says, no, it's way too long, just give them 48 hours, and if they don't answer you in 48 hours, you tell me, and I'm going to kick their asses, and they're going to answer you. So it really depends on the management style, the period, the case. So that's something that you deal this way. Remember that you need to enforce that delay. You are the coordinator of the whole process. You cannot expect the users on the other side to do the things that they said they were doing. So you have to have a deal with the main correspondent about how to manage that, and you always have to keep him informed of what's going on and what is not working correctly. This way steps can be taken very fast, and you're not going to end up stuck in the mud for months because you don't have what you need. So of course, each time an answer arrives, you have several things to do. Modify the tree view, either being it a doc, a Word document, or a web page. Add the link to the corresponding document inside that. Eventually send secondary questions, and of course incorporate the received information in the requirement list. You are managing this list of question and answer as a management tool. It's not your ultimate document. Your ultimate document is the requirement list, and the requirement list should contain absolutely all information about the project. So everything that is received from the customer's correspondence needs to be added either as a new item or as a clarification of an existing item in the requirement list. It will be a condensed version of your question and answer. It can be 1 sentence, 1 word, 3 pages of information. It depends, of course, of the question. So, of course, this phase can count many cycles. It depends of the complexity of the project. It depends of the number of time a question begs for more questions. So there will be as many cycles as needed. And each cycle, of course, makes the requirement list more complete. You are going to end up with a very big, potentially, document. So At this point, the requirement list is much more complete, and by example, the payment management we are talking about now has sub-chapters per type of letter to be managed. So you have your payment management, the customer doesn't pay, he's going to receive first a letter or an email with that text, then after 2 more weeks he's going to receive that, then this and that. So all that is going to be several steps in the payment management, and there will be a new line, sub-line, sub-chapter, as you want to call them, in your requirement list. Of course, each chapter, sub-chapter or line will contain a detailed description text with, when needed, a UI prototype image, which is very easy and fast to do in WinDev. Giving the customer an idea on how it's going to work, and if it's not necessary for the things that are really simple, it's very often a good idea to include a UI prototype image in and a text explaining how the UI is going to work when the process is complex and is concerning something that is critical for the customer. By example, if you are going to design software for a restaurant, the way the order is going to be taken is crucial for them. It has to be simple, it has to be fast, it has to be clear. So giving them a prototype of the UI is a very good thing, because they will say, oh no, that's not possible, we are going to have a problem there, and you didn't even know that there was a question about that before. So that's really an important point. When the requirement list is coherent enough, which is basically when I don't have any more questions, or at least not any question that was not answered, then it's time for commands. The commands are from the future users. I'm not talking about the main correspondent now anymore, or the secondary ones. I'm talking about the real day-to-day users. Of course, this phase is not mandatory. In some cases, in some companies, it will not even be accepted or understood by the direction. But if you can manage that, it's extremely useful. It allows you to deal with problems that are not thought important by the correspondents, or even not known by the correspondents. Remember that these correspondents are generally the head of divisions, groups, section, and so on, and that they are not the one doing the manual work. This work has to be managed by your software. So when a regular worker has a problem and his boss is not aware of it, or doesn't think about it, or just doesn't care, well, it's not included as a solution function in the software, and the regular user sometimes just cannot use the software. So to do that, each module description, the detailed description that is now in the requirement list, is sent to either all the users that are concerned by that module. By example, the description of the billing function is going to be sent to everybody who is creating bills, or more reasonably in some big organization, by only a selection of users that are concerned by each point. This selection can either be designed or composed of the best performers, or the people that are really the best one in each department, and this list of names is going to be given to you by each correspondent, of course. Or it can be done by volunteers. I found out that it's generally much better to work with volunteers at that point, because these people are interested, they are willing to spend time on that. The other one perhaps are the best performer in their day-to-day work, but they don't really care about the tool or this kind of thing. So personally, I prefer to work in a system where the people are volunteering to really try to have a good tool for the future. So for me, the second choice is generally better, but you don't always have the decision on that point. And remember that this user, the same user, are going to be necessary in the test phase. So it's really important that everything goes well with them. They are needed now to be sure that you design the right thing, and they're going to be needed afterwards to test the software and say, okay, there's this problem, that problem. So this is very important phase. Of course, each user will have a defined time to read the description of the module he's concerned with, comment on it, or ask questions if they don't understand something. Very often I found out that these questions are more revealing and the most valuable input that I get back. Just because they ask a question, I don't understand how this is going to work, we have that case where, and suddenly you have a whole new can of worm that is open for you by this guy about something that you never heard about. Oh, you don't have the case of the guy who is buying from another state and we are not giving the taxes the same way, and so on and so forth. So these questions are extremely important. Of course, to manage that, I do the exact same thing that I did for the management of the requirement list. I create a new tree view, either as a Word document or a web page. And in that tree view, I have the usernames. For each user, I have the date at which I expect the command, and I have the received answers, and eventually I have a flow of back and forth information when they ask questions, and I answer them, and they ask questions again, and I answer them, and then I ask questions to them, and they answer me, and so on and so forth. So again, several cycles possible in that phase. All the main correspondents for each module have access to the tree to follow the process, or not. The or not is extremely important. You're going to deal with companies that have very different culture. It can be because they're coming from a different country. It can be that they're just, well, historically very secretive. It can be many things. It can be that the regular user don't really talk to their managers. They just follow the order. So there are many reasons why this user may not want to have their comment visible by the main correspondence. So that's something that you will have to deal with originally when you talk with the main correspondent. Is this phase going to be public or secret? And in some cases, you're even going to have to set up an anonymous letterbox for that phase, which means that you're going to send the detailed description to several users in each department, and you are not going to see who is answering you on what. And some people will not answer you perhaps, and some people will answer you, but you will never know who they are, and nobody will know. And that will be the only way for you to get really meaningful information. It's really hard to deal with that kind of situation, but there are really companies where the social climate is bad. The second part of the commands phase starts by creating a synthesis of the request, question, and command for each module. Then, of course, add your own commands, thought, and questions to the mix, and send to the correspondence for each module. Of course, the preview at that point now shows the synthesis sent to each correspondent, the received answer date, and so on. You're managing that part exactly the same way that you are managing the part with the users. Of course, also each answer that is received is incorporated in the requirement list. It can be a new module, it can be a sub-module, it can be some more text for a module to explain this or that, but you have to incorporate that in the requirement list. And then, once you have received all the answer from all the correspondents, you have to restart the phase 1 for comments. You have to resend each module that has been modified. Of course, if something was absolutely not touched, you don't need to do that. But for each module that has been modified, you have to send a new detailed description to each user, in order to see if, well, the new way of doing things doesn't create another problem or doesn't make them think about something else that they didn't think about before. And you're going to do that perhaps several times in order to gain active support from the users. What is active support? Active support is when the users are impatient to use the resulting software. They can't wait to have it. They're telling you, oh, I can't wait to have that. It's going to solve so much problem for me. It's going to be so great. Well, if you're able to do that, it means that your description match their needs, that they find enough advantage in the software you're giving them, and that it's going to be much easier when you're installing, training, testing. Because one thing that I've learned about is resistance coming from the user. They are used to work a certain way, even if it's a really bad one. You tell them you have to change completely the way you work to use my software. Well, perhaps it's going to happen, but not very fast. And perhaps it's not going to happen at all. I've seen users continuing to work with paper and pen, not telling me anything, and just telling their manager, oh, it doesn't work. No precision, no question, no bug report, nothing. It doesn't work, we use paper and pen. And you have to deal with that. So if you are able to make the user really active supporter of your solution, you've win a really big battle, and it's that command phase that you're going to be able to achieve that. This problem of resistance from users is generally not emphasized enough by developers. When they talk to the customer, the boss of the company, they generally don't talk about that, and the customer doesn't know about it and has absolutely no understanding of it. Obviously for him, if he's doing that, it's because it's going to be much better for the company. But why would the employee not agree with that? Well, it's not the employee, that's why. So it's something that they don't know about generally, and when you have problem during the installation, the training, testing phase, it's much easier to blame the software or the developers than the user who are resisting the changes. So it's something you have to deal with, and that phase of the requirement list development is made for that. Once the command phase is done, the requirement list is supposedly complete on a technical standpoint. So at this point you have to send it to each correspondent for approval, either just the part that they are concerned with or the whole thing, to give them an idea of everything else. And also at this point you're going to manage that via your submission tree once again, and wait for the answer, and so on and so forth. At that point, with the previous cycles of command phase, the approbation should be 100%. If you didn't forget a huge thing, or if the user didn't forget a huge thing that suddenly pops up, you should be in for just a smooth ride, and people just tell you, okay, that's perfect, that's exactly what we need. If not, you're good to start again with the several phases on the points that just popped up. You don't have to go through everything again, but perhaps this point is going to change other point, and you're again going to do that till you have this approbation at 100%. Of course, at this point, your requirement list can still contain options that are incompatible with each other, functions that are optional, functions that are desired by the user but will be developed only in the second phase of work, or never, depending on the budget, depending on the price. So your requirement list is still not made of concrete. Things will probably still change till you get the money corresponding to it. We already saw that the estimate part is not really part of the requirement list. It's the next step, and clearly the requirement list can be used to ask for estimate from other company. It's often the case on big projects. You have to be ready for it, and you have to be ready to accept the cost of doing some requirement list for free if you want to get some jobs. That's how it is. But it's only when the requirement list is that precise, after you went through all these steps and all these cycles, that a valid estimate can be done. Of course, you can always say, okay, it's going to cost you $50,000. How did you want to find that that amount? You have no idea. Perhaps you're going to make a lot of money on it, perhaps you're going to lose a lot of money on it. I don't like to give any estimate before I have a full requirement list, and I generally don't, or it has to be an extremely high amount. Even with that level of precision in the requirement list, modification will be necessary. Don't kid yourself. There will be things that somebody didn't think about. So either the customer wants something else, or thinks suddenly that he forgot to tell you about one really important thing, or there is a technical problem somewhere that you didn't find when working on the requirement list. You didn't think that with the amount of data that the user is dealing with, the time necessary to do one specific function is 2 months, which of course is not acceptable. You need to do things in a different way, find a way, do something, and of course that was not in the requirement list. When I give an estimate to a customer, point 2 is free and 1 is payable. Point 2 is free because I made a mistake. I had all the information, the customer told me everything, I thought that it would be okay like that, and it's not okay because this or that I didn't think about. My mistake, I pay for it. When the customer wants something else, he'll pay for it because it's not in the requirement list and I had no way of knowing about it before. And this is a strategy that is working in all cases. Even if the customer wants to sue you, have a hard time doing so with a precise requirement list, and you coming with about 20 kilos of papers of printout of all the emails and exchange that you had with the customer. So that is something that works, that is perfectly acceptable, and that you can use with your customer too. Of course, this methodology gives the customer and the developer a high level of security. What will be done is precisely described in the requirement list. So when you start to develop, you just have to follow the requirement list. You don't have to run all over the place to ask questions. and when you give the result to the customer, he gets what was described in the requirement list. So everything should be okay. Well, not all the time, of course, because some people don't understand what they read, but most of the time with that methodology you're going to be in good shape. You're going to build a very good relationship with your customer, and have a customer happy is the best way to gain more customer. Of course, in the software industry, estimates are very often not final and extremely different from the final price. I think we all have in mind example from governmental project, by example, where the original estimate is 3 million and the final price is 15. Well, there are many of them like that, and the reason why is often that the requirement list is very bad to begin with. Very often this requirement list has been done entirely internally in the company, in the administration that is asking for the software, and they don't have any good methodology to develop that requirement list. They certainly don't go through all the loops and cycles that I just described, and the result is something that is full of errors, of course incomplete descriptions, things that you can realize in 20 different ways, none of them being the one that they're going to need. Of course also full of references to information not given the requirement list or annexes. As you can imagine, this kind of requirement list is something that I came around a few times, and clearly it's not popular to tell a customer about it. When you deal with a big company, and no, I'm not going to give any names, but when you deal with a big company and they give you a requirement list asking for a global price for the development, and you read the requirement list, that is, it's a big one, there are 37 pages. Well, it's 37 pages, and on each page you have at least 2 or 3 errors or incomplete information. And when you tell the guy in the company, look, I'm not sure how to take that. You sure it's the correct document you sent me? It's not a joke or a test to see if I can read? Because this thing is unusable. It's full of crap. It's really a recipe for disaster. So when you tell that even more diplomatically to your future customer, you hope, in this company, well, clearly he's not going to like it. And when you give to the guy a list of errors, incomplete information, and so on, well, he has no choice than to say, okay, you're right, this thing is obviously not good, and I'll recontact you when we have a good one. And generally you can wait. But if you still accept a requirement list like that and give a price and start to develop, you have to be ready for a very chaotic ride. This is not going to work smoothly, that's for sure. And you're going to lose a lot of time and a lot of money, which wouldn't be the case if you follow this methodology to create your requirement list or modify the customer. There's a price to pay up front. Try to make the customer pay for it. If not, you will at least recoup the cost when you have a good development cycle afterwards. Thank you.